My name is Calvin Pruett, and I am 58 years old, and I spent 26 years working as a librarian in a small town in eastern Tennessee, and I want you to understand something about libraries before I tell you what happened at my father's funeral, because libraries are not about books the way most. People think they are about information and who has it and who does not, and the difference between those two groups of people is almost always larger than anyone expects, and I grew up understanding that difference in a very specific and personal way because my brother Warren had always been the one with the information, and I had always been the one left to figure things out afterward, and our father Chester Pruett had spent 44 years working at a paper mill, and he had built a quiet, careful life in the house where Warren and I grew up, and he had never talked about money the way some fathers do not talk about money because they came from a generation that believed money was a private matter between a man and his maker, and Warren had always interpreted father's silence on the subject as confirmation of what Warren had decided was true, which was that there was nothing significant to talk about, and Warren had built his own life around that assumption. He had moved to Atlanta in his 30s and built a landscaping business that did well enough, and he drove a new truck every 3 years, and he wore his success the way some men wear. A watch which is visibly and with the intention that you notice, and every time Warren came home for Christmas or Thanksgiving he found small ways to remind me that my librarian salary was not the same as his landscaping revenue, and I had let this go for years the way you let go of things when the person doing them is family, and when the cost of confronting it feels higher than the cost of absorbing it. And my father Chester died on a Wednesday morning in April, quietly in his own bed, the way he had lived, which is to say, without making a fuss, and I was the one who had been there, and I was the one who had driven him to his appointments for the last 2 years and sat with him through the long afternoons when he did not feel like talking, but did not want to be alone, and I was the one who knew which medications he took, and in what order, and which television programs he preferred, and which chair he liked to sit in, when the light came through the window in the late afternoon, and Warren had called on holidays and had sent money occasionally when father mentioned needing something, and this was his version of presents, and I had never said anything about the difference because Chester had never asked me to, and because I was not doing any of it to be recognized I was doing it, because he was my father and he was alone, and that was reason enough, and the funeral was on a Saturday, and Warren drove up from Atlanta on Friday night and arrived at the funeral home on Saturday morning in his new truck and his good suit, and he stood at the entrance greeting people with the confidence of a man who has appointed himself the central figure of an occasion, and people who did not know better assumed he was, because he was loud and certain in the way that reads as authority when you do not look closely, and I stood near the casket and accepted condolences and spoke quietly with the people who had known Chester for decades, the neighbors and the mill workers and the men from his Sunday school class, and at some point Warren came to stand beside me, and a woman named Gloria, who had lived 3 houses down from us our entire childhood, came and took my hands and said, "Calvin, your father talked about you every single time I saw him," and she said it with the particular warmth of someone delivering a message they were trusted to carry, and before I could respond, Warren said, "Well, he had to talk about somebody," and laughed, and Gloria looked at him for a moment with an expression that contained an entire paragraph, and then she squeezed my hands and moved on, and I stood there, and I thought about 26 years of small moments exactly like that one, and I said nothing, because it was my father's funeral, and Chester would not have wanted a scene, and Warren put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Brother, you did what you could with what you had," and I recognized that sentence immediately, because it was the sentence you say to someone when you want to appear generous while actually being cutting, and Warren had always been skilled at that particular construction, and I let it go the way I had let go of all the others, and the burial was at 2 p.m, and afterward we drove to the office of my father's attorney, a man named Herbert Sloane, who had handled Chester's affairs for 22 years, and Herbert was 71 years old and unhurried, in the way that men are unhurried when they have been delivering news. 2. Families for decades, and have learned that the news lands better when it is not rushed, and there were 4 of us in Herbert's office: Warren, and his wife Diane, and myself, and my father's sister, Aunt Roberta, who was 79, and had driven 2 hours that morning and sat in the corner chair with her good handbag on her lap, and Herbert opened a manila folder, and he put on his reading glasses, and he said, "I am going to read the document as Chester prepared it, and then we will discuss any questions," and he began, and the will was not complicated. Chester had not been complicated. Man and Herbert read through the standard provisions, the personal property, the vehicle, the small savings account, and then he reached the section concerning the primary asset, and he paused the way Herbert Sloane paused when he was about to read something he had read before, but knew would land differently in a room than it did on paper, and he read, "And the primary asset being the property and mineral rights associated with 340 acres of land in Morgan County, Tennessee, held in trust since 1987, and generating annual lease income from 2 active natural gas operations, is hereby bequeathed in its entirety to my son Calvin James Pruitt in recognition of his presence, his constancy, and his understanding of what it means to stay." And Herbert looked up, and the room was very quiet, and Warren said, "What property?" and Herbert said, "The Morgan County land. Chester purchased it in 1987, and Warren said, "I did not know about any land," and Herbert said Chester was aware of that, and Warren said, "What does it generate?" and Herbert looked at the document and said, "The current annual lease income is approximately $94,000, and the assessed land value is $1.3 million. And Diane made a sound that was not quite a word, and Warren sat, very still the way people sit when they are running rapid calculations, and coming up short, and Aunt Roberta in the corner chair nodded once, slowly the nod of a woman who had known something for a long time and was watching it become known to others, and I sat in the chair across from Herbert Sloane's desk, and I thought about my father Chester in his chair by the window in the late afternoon light, and I thought about the appointments and the medications and the long quiet afternoons, and I thought about the fact that Chester had never mentioned the Morgan County land to me, not once in 26 years, and I understood why, because Chester was a man who believed that the right information reached people at the right time and not before, and he had trusted Herbert Sloane to deliver it at the correct moment, which was this one. And Warren turned to me and said, "Cal, did you know about this?" And I said, "No, Warren, I did not." And he said, "How is that possible?" And I said, "I imagine Dad thought it was a private matter between himself and his maker." And Aunt Roberta made a sound in The corner that I believe was a laugh converted at the last moment into a cough. And Warren said, "This is not right." And Herbert said, "Chester prepared this document in full legal capacity and reviewed it twice in the last. 3 years most recently in January, and Warren said, I want to contest this." And Herbert removed his glasses and looked at Warren the way a man looks at something he has seen before, and said, "Warren, your father left you the vehicle, the personal property, and the savings account, and he also left a letter which I will now read." And Herbert picked up a sealed envelope and opened it and read, and the letter was 7 sentences, and I will not share all of them, because they were between a father and his son, but the last sentence was this: "I gave you everything you needed to build your own life, and you built it, and I am proud of you, and I gave Calvin something different, which was my time, and he gave me his. And this is how I have chosen to honor that." And Herbert folded the letter, and the room was quiet again, and Warren stood up and buttoned his jacket the way men button their jackets when they are leaving a room and do not want to appear to be fleeing it, and he and Diane left, and the door closed. And Aunt Roberta looked at me from her corner chair and said, "Your father was a patient man," and I said, "I know," and she said, "Patience is a kind of intelligence, Calvin, and most people do not understand that." And Herbert poured 2 small glasses of water from the pitcher on his desk and slid one across to me, and I sat in that office for another hour going through the documents, and when I walked out to the parking lot the afternoon, light was the same quality it had been in my father's room on those long, quiet afternoons, and I stood beside my car, and I thought about 26 years of driving him to appointments and sitting in the silence and learning which programs he preferred. And I thought about Warren's sentence at the funeral, "Brother, you did what you could with what you had." And I thought, yes, Warren, that is exactly what I did. And it turned out what I had was more than either of us knew. And I drove home, and I called my daughter Nessa, who is in college in Knoxville. And I told her, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, did you know?" And I said no. And she said, "Really?" And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Grandpa Chester and I said yes." And she laughed the kind of laugh that is mostly astonishment. And I sat in my car, in my driveway, and I thought about Herbert Sloane's unhurried voice reading one line, and I thought about my grandfather's saying which Chester had passed to me when I was young, which was that the quietest people in any room are usually the ones who have read the most, and if you have spent years being the quiet one, the steady one, the one who stayed, I want you to hear this, the people who stay are always the ones who understand what they have, and if you have ever been underestimated by someone who is too busy performing to pay attention, just keep showing up and let the attorney do the rest.